There you are now. Welcome back to the garage. So this is the second episode on this flywheel setup and improving it and making it better. First thing we're going to check is to see have we increased the holding torque of the flywheel by flattening out that diaphragm. And then we'll go, and if that is obviously positive and it is good, we'll go and do the machining work that is required to make that permanent. After that then, get it all bolted back together and ready to go off to be balanced out of house. Let's go and check the torque. So I have the same setup as we had before. We have our torque measuring setup and our torque wrench is set at the 90 foot-pounds that it was before. So let's see if this is holding the 90 pounds. Okay, so it's now holding that 90 pounds. It slipped at that before. Let's take it up to 100 and see can it hold 100. It's holding the 100. Let's go for 110. Holding 110. Let's go for the 115. Okay, so just starting to slip there at 115. If we come back slightly off of that, there we go. So I suppose we could say maybe 111, 112 foot-pounds it's holding now. So that's a massive increase, massive increase. We've gone from 90 now to 112 foot-pounds. Why have we got that increase? We've got that increase because that spring now, rather than being slightly relaxed, is fully tensioned. So we've optimized that clamping load on that back plate and we've given it that extra bit of clearance. Also, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you that this bevel is sitting almost completely flat. Where is my little screwdriver? The one I keep throwing away. Here it is. So if you come in here from the side, and you'll see now our bevel spring is sitting pretty much dead flat. Okay, it's just ever so slightly past parallel, so we're not going to take quite that much off of the horns. So what we've done is we brought the horns together by the thickness of these three driving straps. We're not going to take quite that off it because it is just slightly past parallel, so there's probably another small bit to get out of it. So what I think we'll do is we will measure where that needs to be. So how we're going to do that is we're just going to back these bolts off slightly. So what I'm doing now is I'm just loosening these bolts off ever so slightly, and what that's doing is it's allowing the pressure plate move away from the flywheel, and I'm able to see exactly what height I want them to sit at. Okay, that's great. I have that sitting. Let's just see if that's made any change to the holding torque. So we know it was slipping at just 115. So let's just see, has that changed it at all? Oh. Okay, let's just try. So that now has us at 120 foot-pounds. So we've gained another 5 foot-pounds. So it is very important to make sure that that string is completely parallel. It's a sort of a fine tuning to get just the best you can get out of it. The closer we get this to full holding torque, again, the easier it is going to be to press. So like I said, taking those driving straps out, it's a rough guide, and fine-tuning it from there then gets you the exact amount that you need to have. I'm just after letting them off a tiny bit more. I think we're about as far as we're going to go here now. Okay, it's just starting to slip there now at that. So that's 125 foot-pounds. So we've gained another 5 foot-pounds on top of that. So fine tuning these is very important, getting to that spot exactly where it is. Anybody can do this in their garage at home. This is something that you can do. You have an old primary gear and a socket and a torque wrench. It's not complex stuff. I know the milling machine here and all that might look a little bit complex. It's just what I have. You can check those pressures with a drill press. Anything at all will do it. But the difference this will make to your flywheel setup, as you can see, is, what was this slipping at, 90 pounds? 90 pounds, and now we've gotten it to 125 pounds. What an increase that we can get. Now we're going to do some measurements and do the machining on the horns. So what I've done is I've just gone around with a feeler blade and checked to make sure the clearance we've made. So I've been backing this bolt off here, which has been creating clearance between the diaphragm and the horn, and we are getting maximum closing torque when the diaphragm is this far away from the horn, which is 0.65 of a millimeter. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure these, which is where we know it was at. So if we measure those, what we see is they're 2 millimeters thick. Yeah, so they're right on 2 millimeters. So we know we need to take off the horn of this, we need to take 2 millimeters minus that 0.6. So we know we need to take 1.4 mil off the horn. We take 1.4 mil off the horn, put the whole lot back together. This is where we'll end up, and we know we'll have the highest standing torque that this flywheel and clutch setup can hold. So this is where I'm cutting that bit of relief that I told you earlier on that I wanted to put in there for to help make sure that we don't nip the primary gear at any stage afterwards. This extra bit of clearance in here. As I said, these flywheels aren't machined wrong, they're just machined for standard clearances, but you know, crankshafts even that have been fully reworked, toughened and hardened are old crankshafts, and the tapers aren't what they used to be on them. So the flywheels generally always move that little bit further up the crank. So by doing this one little machining job here, you're buying yourself a little bit of extra clearance, and what it reduces in the taper is so small that it won't affect the taper in any way, but makes some difference when you go and put the whole thing back together and find that your flywheel doesn't fit, or that your thrust is pinched. So this is a machining operation that you could do on a lathe as well. Just because we're on the milling machine today doing a few other jobs, I said I'd set up and do it here. It's just a boring head, and I'm just taking a couple of cuts, a couple of passes to get me out to the size I want. How much am I reducing? How much depth am I adding here? About 2.5 mil. That's what I've found in the past seems to be the kind of sweet number. They don't tend to move on any further than about 2 or 2.5 mil. That puts a bit of clearance in there. And as I said, the only thing it's doing is reducing the surface area ever so slightly of the taper, because you're reducing some of the taper a little bit by taking this 2.5 mil out. But for me, it's been completely successful in the past and has saved a lot of heartache from getting the whole thing put together and then suddenly finding that you don't have clearance. The next machining operation we'll do is to put the clearance on the horns of the pressure plate. So just before I move on to machining the horns of the flywheel or of the pressure plate, I just want to show you what I was talking about. So here's the primary gear sitting on the end of the crankshaft, and you can see it wants to float, so it wants to spin. So drive is coming through the crankshaft into the flywheel. The flywheel is going to sit onto that taper. And then it's transmitted through the clutch plate, which is sandwiched between the pressure plate and the flywheel. The clutch plate is sitting on this, and the flywheel is sitting on the nose of the crank. If that space in there isn't deep enough, what can happen is, as you tighten this flywheel on to the crankshaft like that, what can happen is the flywheel can move up the crankshaft and sit against this C-washer here, and it will press that and pinch that whole arrangement. If it clamps hard enough, it'll pinch that up against its thrust bear in this end, and the primary gear and the crank will become one. If that happens, it all spins together, and then you won't be able to get the car into gear. Even if it happens just the slightest little bit, if that goes up there just the smallest little bit and pinches it, it may still be able to turn, but it may drag. And if it drags, every time you go to select gear, you'll get that crunching feeling, or you'll get a notch between gears as you go, say, between first and second. The one that always shows this up is reverse. If the box isn't completely stopped, reverse will crash. So if you select reverse, you'll get this kind of crunch coming in, and you'll know that the gearbox isn't completely stopped. If you've ever driven forward and then caught reverse quickly on the way back, you get that little crunch. But if that's happening after you've fitted a new flywheel to your system, you've one of two things happening. Either the pressure plate is not clearing properly, or this is what's happened. The flywheel has run up the end of the crank on the taper of the crank and has pinched this primary gear. So that's one of the reasons why I always machine that extra little bit of clearance in there. It has no effect really on the taper by the amount of material that's holding it, but that extra bit of clearance makes such a difference from making sure that you don't seize that primary gear. Okay, so we're just going to touch off on the horn to get our baseline, our zero. So it's just touching there now. So we'll just pull off the side of that. We'll zero out our dial gauge. And we know from our measurements before we want to take 1.4 off. So let's just start with 0.5. So let's just dial in 0.5 here. And we'll take a nice handy pass at 0.5. Now this is EN16, so it's pretty hard stuff, and we're using high speed steel cutters, so we want to just take our time here and just run around the top of this without stressing the cutter. So we're just going to do 0.5, then we'll do another 0.5, and then we'll do our finishing pass then at 0.4. That was one of our 0.5s. Let's dial in another one. That's our millimeter there. So we're climb cutting this because it's high speed steel. It's much better to climb cut high speed steel. So it's just to keep the cutter engaged with the material all the time. Now we've won, so we'll dial in the 0.4 now for our finishing pass. Okay, that's the horn brought to size. We've one last thing to check before we can start a test assembly. We need to check to make sure we still have enough depth for our bolt to sit down into. I'll show you what I mean now. So one of the last things we want to do just before we finish our machining and take this out of the machine center is to make sure that that nut will close or the bolt will close all the way down onto the pillar. There's recesses in each one of these pillars to allow that nut or bolt to go down into, and it must be able to go down into that to locate. So that one is going down there fine. So that at least tells us now that we're pretty much ready to go back together. The only thing we want to do now is just break these edges. A couple of edges just to be broken there that are kind of sharp edges. So we just run around them with the file and just take those sharp burrs that are on them off. Great, now our flywheel can go back together and we can do a bit more testing and see have we got the result we wanted. So our last operation here is to just take a small amount of the spacers for the driving straps. So obviously if we've taken it off the horn, we also need to take it off the driving strap. Now, we took 1.4 off the horns, but I'm only going to take 1.2 off these spacers. You get a little bit more clamping load if you keep these spacers just slightly higher. So at 1.2 that gives us 0.2 higher than the driving straps, which is kind of where we want to be. These are really hard steel, you know, I'm using TCM insert here, which cuts it really nicely, but if you were trying to turn this with high speed steel, you want to turn them nice and slow with plenty of cutting fluid. So we're just creeping up on the 1.2 now. Just a little rub of the file now just to deboard them. And we're ready to put the flywheel together. We're back over at the milling machine here, but we're just using my little jig setup here to line everything up so we can get everything back in line where it should be. This will all have to go off to be balanced when we're finally finished with it. I don't do balancing here in-house. I have a brilliant local company that does that for me. They have a really high quality, expensive piece of kit that does all the balancing for me, and I know it's done to the highest possible standard. So there's just some things that you're better off outsourcing. So what we'll do is we'll put this together and we'll perform our last few checks just to confirm everything we did is the way we expected it to be. You got to make sure when you're tightening up these bolts that you pull them all up evenly. You can't pull any one side up more than the other for a couple of reasons. One, it helps center the diaphragm in the middle of the taper that's inside on the flywheel, but it also pulls the diaphragm down and clamps it evenly all the way around. This will get a final assembly, which I'll be doing off the camera before it goes to get balanced, where I'll put Loctite on there, and all these bolts will be brought up to torque with a torque wrench. But obviously just for you guys for the video, I just want to quickly put it together to show you the difference that we have achieved by doing what we did. So next thing we'll do is we'll get our pressure gauge set up again and see at what pressure this is now opening at. So I have this just clamped down, so you can see we're just at 1,000 pounds or 60 bar pressure in our setup here, and we can see I have the clutch plate completely released. There's the clutch plate moving completely freely there. So I'm just poking it with the screwdriver just to move the clutch plate around, and you can see that it's moving free. So our clutch is released and we're at 1,000 pounds. If you remember back to the start of the video, we weren't getting the clutch to start to release until 1,200 pounds. Now, these pressure figures are a calculated figure because there's a gear ratio here, and the pressure is against, you'd have to work out the capacity of the cylinder versus the surface area it's pressing on, but it's a relative pressure measurement that gives me a relative pressure measurement against the start. We took a measurement at the start and its opening pressure was over 80 bar, it was 1,200, and now we've reduced the open pressure down to 1,000, which has taken 200 pounds of pressure out of the opening circuit. Next thing we're going to do is go back to the device and see, have we got that 120 foot-pounds of breakaway torque that we got when we were playing around with the setup earlier on. So we are at our 100 foot-pounds, and it wouldn't hold 90 before. That's 100. Let's take her up to the 110. It's holding 110. Let's take it to its final. Okay, that's 120, and that's pretty much off the scales for this torque wrench now. That's just completely wound off the scale now. We're going to move the flywheel in the device. Okay, so just getting to slip there. We don't know because we're off the scale in the torque wrench, but it's probably like 128 or 130 pounds. So we know it's holding the 120 anyway, and then off the scale. So I think that's a massive improvement on that flywheel. We're at the stage now where all that needs to be done now is this needs to head off and be balanced. We get that done, as I said, out of house. Our driving straps are sitting exactly the way I want, just a tiny little bit up higher than the horns of the anvil or of the pressure plate, which just gives us that little bit more holding pressure, which is why we now see that going off the scale. When we checked it before, remember, we didn't have the driving straps in there. Now we're getting that extra little bit of holding power. You see it going off the scale. So we now have a flywheel assembly that is ready to take the load that it is designed for. It's easier to release, meaning that it's going to be easier on the engine, and generally it's in tune the way it should be. We'll get it properly balanced now to 0.5 gram, and that flywheel will be ready to fit to the car. We'll see that in a coming episode in the future. This will be a really nice clutch pedal to press. It is going to be heavy. It's an orange diaphragm. It's holding 120 plus foot-pounds of torque statically, but it's the best that it can be. I hope you enjoyed this episode, coming along with me as I tune up one of these flywheels. As you see, guys, I all the time try and think of ways of doing stuff here in my own home shop that allows me to get really good, repeatable results. Hopefully it'll encourage you to go out and try and do the same thing in your shop. If you enjoyed the episode, please give us a thumbs up. If you have any questions or you want to see clarity on anything, hit us up down in the comments below. I love reading your comments and chatting back with you guys. It gives us a bit of feedback as well. If you're new to the channel, you are really very, very welcome. We hope you like it, and I hope I have earned a subscribe from what you see either here today or in some of our other episodes. Other than that, there's nothing more for me to say, but see you on the next one.